The 25th of June 1950. Before sunrise, along the 38th parallel, the ground began to move, not with an earthquake, but with engines. Soviet-built T-34 tanks pushed through the morning haze. Artillery opened across the border. Columns of North Korean infantry crossed into the Republic of Korea, and in a matter of hours, a divided peninsula became the first great battlefield of the Cold War. In Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, Moscow, Beijing, and at the United Nations, men who had just survived World War II suddenly faced a question they could not avoid. Was this a local invasion or the opening move of World War III? The United Nations Security Council identified the attack by North Korean forces as a breach of the peace and called for withdrawal. 2 days later, it recommended that member states assist South Korea in repelling the attack. The answer seemed simple at first. North Korea had invaded. South Korea was collapsing. America had to decide whether a line drawn 5 years earlier on a map was worth American lives. But the real story of the Korean War is not simple. It is the story of a war America entered to stop aggression, then nearly expanded into a war against China and possibly the Soviet Union. It is the story of soldiers sent into battle before they were ready, generals who won impossible victories and then misread the battlefield, pilots fighting the first jet war over MiG Alley, Marines and soldiers freezing in the mountains around Chosin, and politicians in Washington trying to keep a limited war from becoming an unlimited catastrophe. This is the war remembered as forgotten, but it was never small. It tested the United Nations before the organization had found its footing. It tested the American military after demobilization had hollowed out much of its World War II strength. It tested whether the United States could fight communism without using every weapon it possessed. And it tested something even harder, whether a democracy could absorb losses, restrain its own anger, and still hold the line. To understand why Korea exploded, we have to go back to the end of World War II, when Japan's empire collapsed and Korea, after decades under Japanese colonial rule, was liberated but not unified. The peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel, with Soviet forces accepting the Japanese surrender in the north and American forces in the south. What was supposed to be temporary became permanent. Two rival governments emerged: Kim Il-sung's Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and Syngman Rhee's Republic of Korea in the south. Each claimed legitimacy over all Korea. Each believed the other was temporary, and between them stood a border that was not yet a wall, but already a warning. Before we go back to the line that split Korea in two, take a moment to support Declassified War Stories. If you value military history told through strategy, sacrifice, forgotten documents, and the hard choices behind America's wars, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This war was called forgotten for a reason, but the men who fought it, and the decisions that nearly changed the world, deserve to be remembered. By 1950, the Cold War had hardened. The Soviet Union had atomic weapons. China's civil war had ended with Mao Zedong's communist victory. The United States had watched one vast Asian country fall out of the Western-aligned camp. And now another crisis had arrived on a narrow peninsula that many Americans could not locate on a map. Korea mattered not because it was large, but because it became the test case. If armed invasion succeeded there, American leaders feared the lesson might travel to Europe, to Taiwan, to Iran, to every exposed frontier of the post-war order. The United States did not go to Korea because it expected glory. It went because surrendering the principle of collective defense at the first real test could have broken the credibility of the world America had just helped build. The first days were catastrophic. Seoul fell quickly. South Korean forces, unevenly trained and lightly equipped, were driven back. American units in Japan were rushed across the water, but the United States Army of 1,950 was not the Army of 1,945. The victory parades were over. Divisions had been reduced. Equipment was worn. Training had slipped. The first American ground unit sent forward, Task Force Smith, was not a spearhead of overwhelming power. It was a delaying force, built from 2 rifle companies and supporting units of the 24th Infantry Division, flown from Japan to Pusan and moved toward Osan to buy time. On the 5th of July, 1950, it ran into North Korean armor and infantry. Official Army history describes the force as badly outnumbered, without armor, without effective anti-tank weapons, and without air support. It was overrun. The next day, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith could assemble roughly half of his original force. That first American fight in Korea exposed the gap between reputation and readiness. The men had courage. What they did not have was enough of almost everything else. They had been sent to slow an enemy whose tanks could roll through their lines. They fought because delay mattered. Every hour they held, every roadblock, every ridge, every destroyed bridge helped pull more troops, ammunition, aircraft, and supplies into the war. Korea would become a war of hills and weather and politics. But in those first weeks, it was a war of time. The North Koreans were trying to win before America could fully arrive. America was trying to survive long enough to become America again. The retreat carried United Nations forces south and east toward the port city of Pusan. That port became the hinge of the war. If Pusan fell, the United States and its allies might be thrown off the peninsula. If Pusan held, reinforcements could keep pouring in. Around that shrinking perimeter, soldiers fought in heat, mud, dust, and exhaustion, on ridges whose names rarely appear in school books, but were paid for in blood. General Walton Walker's 8th Army fought a defensive battle measured in miles and days. The Pusan Perimeter was not glamorous. It was not the dramatic turning movement MacArthur wanted. It was men in foxholes. Artillery crews firing until barrels burned, engineers keeping roads open, logisticians feeding a hungry front, and naval and air power striking at North Korean supply lines. Army accounts described the early strategy as trading space for time, dictated by the speed of the North Korean drive and American unpreparedness. This is one of the ignored truths of the Korean War. Before the miracle, there was endurance. Before Inchon, there was Pusan. Before the maps showed arrows racing north, there were men holding ground that seemed too small to hold. The American public later remembered MacArthur's landing, but the landing was only possible because Pusan did not collapse. The line held because soldiers absorbed punishment, because South Korean units continued fighting after disaster, because reinforcements arrived through the port, and because the sea remained open. War is often described by the offensive that changes the map, but sometimes the decisive act is not moving. Sometimes victory begins when exhausted men refuse to move another mile backward. Then came Inchon, the 15th of September, 1950. A harbor with dangerous tides, mudflats, narrow approaches, and seawalls that made planners nervous. Many officers considered the operation risky. MacArthur believed the risk was the point. If the landing worked, United Nations forces would strike far behind North Korean lines, threaten Seoul, cut supply routes, and transform the campaign. If it failed, the war might end in humiliation. Operation Chromite was an amphibious gamble in a war that had nearly been lost. It succeeded. Marines and soldiers landed at Inchon, fought inland, and helped break the back of the North Korean offensive. 4 days later, 8th Army broke out from the Pusan Perimeter, and on September 29, Seoul was declared liberated. The images were irresistible: landing craft, naval guns, Marines climbing sea walls, Seoul returning to South Korean control. MacArthur, already a legend from the Pacific War, appeared to have delivered one of the most brilliant reversals in modern military history. And in operational terms, it was brilliant. A defeated defensive campaign had become an offensive pursuit. North Korean forces that had seemed unstoppable were suddenly shattered and retreating. But Inchon also created a dangerous illusion. It made victory look closer than it was. It made risk look like genius. It made some commanders believe that boldness could solve every strategic problem. And it moved the war from restoring South Korea to deciding the fate of the North. After Inchon, the central question changed. The first objective had been to repel the invasion and restore South Korea. But once North Korean forces were falling apart, should United Nations forces cross the 38th parallel and destroy Kim Il-sung's regime? The United Nations General Assembly supported steps toward a unified, independent Korea, and the battlefield seemed to offer the chance. But beyond North Korea lay China. Beyond China stood the Soviet Union. In Korea, geography itself became a warning. Every mile north brought United Nations forces closer to the Yalu River, the border with Manchuria, and closer to a power that had just emerged from civil war with millions of soldiers and a revolutionary government determined not to be encircled. Washington tried to balance ambition and caution. It wanted the aggression punished. It wanted Korea stabilized. It did not want another world war. MacArthur's command, operating from Tokyo, believed that Chinese intervention was unlikely or manageable. In the field, United Nations forces drove north. Pyongyang fell. Units pushed toward the Yalu. There was talk of the troops being home by Christmas, for men who had been retreating only weeks earlier. The change was almost unbelievable. But the enemy had changed too. The North Korean army was no longer the only force in the mountains. The first signs were easy to dismiss if someone wanted to dismiss them. Chinese prisoners appeared. Patrols ran into forces that fought hard and then disappeared. Army history notes that the capture of a Chinese soldier on October 25, 1950, marked a fundamental change in the conflict, and that debate followed inside United Nations Command and Washington about China's intentions. In early November, Chinese forces struck in both the west and the east, then broke contact, creating uncertainty about their strength and purpose. United Nations pilots also began encountering Soviet-made MiG-15 jet fighters. This was one of the great intelligence and command failures of the war. The warning signs existed, but they did not produce the right conclusion fast enough. The Chinese intervention was not a rumor. It was not a phantom. It was moving through the mountains, mostly at night, hidden by terrain and discipline. Chinese forces were not trying to match American firepower directly. They were trying to close distance, strike flanks, isolate units, overwhelm positions, and exploit the gaps between advancing formations. They understood something United Nations commanders were in danger of forgetting. A long advance can become a trap if the enemy chooses the moment to cut it. Then the trap closed. In late November 1950, the war changed from pursuit to survival. Chinese forces struck across the front. In the west, the 8th Army was hit along the Chosin River. South Korean formations were smashed in places. American units were forced into withdrawal. In the east, X-Corps faced the nightmare that would become Chosin Reservoir. The cold itself became an enemy. Weapons froze. Medical supplies froze. Wounded men froze. The landscape was mountains, ice, narrow roads, and ambushes. The phrase fighting retreat is often used, but it can sound too clean. At Chosin, men had to break through roadblocks, carry wounded, protect columns, and fight in temperatures so low that survival was never guaranteed. Official Army material describes the 1st Marine Division, with attached U.S. and British Army units, as surrounded by an enemy force estimated at 4 Chinese armies near Hagaru Ri. Before battling southeast toward the coast in one of the great fighting withdrawals of the war, Chosin became more than a battle. It became a test of cohesion. The men there were not advancing to glory. They were fighting to keep units intact under pressure that could have shattered them. The airlift, close air support, engineers, road security, trucks, artillery, and naval evacuation all mattered. Modern audiences often imagine war as a contest of weapons, but Chosin showed that survival depends on systems. Communications, supply, command discipline, medical evacuation, route clearance, and the ability of units to keep moving when every instinct says stop. It also showed that the Chinese intervention had not merely added troops to the enemy side. It had transformed the war's political meaning. America was now fighting Chinese forces in Korea while trying not to turn that fight into a direct war against China. By December 1950, the mood in Washington was grim. The Truman Library's Korean War collections include documents on how U.S. conduct of the war changed once Chinese Communist troops became involved, reflecting the scale of the crisis. The question was no longer whether North Korea could be defeated quickly. It was whether United Nations forces could avoid disaster, rebuild a line, and preserve South Korea without triggering a larger conflict. At this point, the Korean War revealed its most dangerous feature. It was a limited war fought by a superpower that had unlimited weapons. The United States possessed nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union possessed nuclear weapons. China did not yet have them, but it was aligned with Moscow. Every military option carried political consequences. Bombing bases across the Yalu might help the battlefield, but it could widen the war. Blockading China might pressure Beijing, but it could provoke Soviet responses. Using nuclear weapons was discussed in the atmosphere of crisis, but any move toward that line risked changing human history. Korea became the place where America learned that victory in the atomic age could no longer mean simply doing everything possible. Restraint became part of strategy. This restraint created a bitter fight at the top. General MacArthur wanted a wider war, or at least far greater freedom to strike beyond Korea and pressure China. President Harry S. Truman believed the war had to remain limited. The conflict between them was not just personal, although personality mattered. It was constitutional and strategic. Who controlled war policy? The elected civilian government or the theater commander? What was the objective? Saving South Korea or defeating communism in Asia by expanding the war? The Truman Library preserves a major collection of documents related to Truman's decision to relieve MacArthur of command over United Nations forces in Korea. In April 1951, Truman dismissed one of America's most famous generals. For many Americans at the time, the decision was shocking. MacArthur was a symbol of victory in the Pacific. He had accepted Japan's surrender. He had rebuilt Japan under occupation. He had delivered Inchon. Truman was an unpopular president fighting an unpopular war. But civilian control of the military is not tested when generals and presidents agree. It is tested when a commander with enormous public stature challenges the limits set by elected authority. Truman's decision did not make the war popular. It did not bring back the dead. But it established that in the nuclear age, no general, however celebrated, could decide alone whether a limited war would become a world war. On the battlefield, another commander changed the war in a different way. General Matthew Ridgway arrived to take over 8th Army after the death of General Walton Walker in a Jeep accident. Ridgway brought urgency, discipline, and a restored sense of purpose. The front had been retreating, morale had been shaken, but Ridgway understood that the Chinese offensives had limits. Chinese troops could infiltrate, mass, and attack with terrible force, but their logistics were vulnerable. They had difficulty sustaining operations under American firepower, air attack, artillery, and long supply lines. The answer was not panic. The answer was to regain contact, use firepower intelligently, hold strong positions, and counterattack when the enemy's offensive energy faded. Army histories of the period describe the transition from the Chinese intervention crisis into the effort to restore balance in early 1951. The war moved south again, then north again. Seoul changed hands more than once. For civilians, these shifts were not arrows on a map. They were hunger, fear, flight, occupation, accusation, and ruin. Families moved with what they could carry. Villages became front lines. Roads filled with refugees and military traffic. The Korean War was not only a military contest between armies. It was a civil war, an international war, an ideological war, and a human catastrophe compressed into mountains and cities where ordinary people had little control over the forces destroying their lives. By spring 1951, United Nations forces had stabilized the front near the 38th parallel. The dream of a quick liberation of the entire peninsula was gone. The fear of total collapse had also receded. What remained was something harder to explain to the public. A war fought for position, leverage, and political outcome. The United States was no longer trying to conquer North Korea. It was trying to preserve South Korea and force an armistice from a position of strength. That kind of war does not produce clean headlines. It produces casualty lists. It produces hills taken and lost. It produces patrols, trenches, bunkers, artillery barrages, and negotiations that drag on while men keep dying. This is where Korea became the template for a new American problem: how to fight without total victory. In World War II, the objective had been unconditional surrender. In Korea, unconditional surrender became unrealistic because the enemy was tied to larger communist powers. The United States could win battles and still not be able to impose the political outcome it wanted at acceptable risk. That lesson would echo for decades. Korea was not Vietnam, but it forced Americans to confront a question that would return in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. What does victory mean when military power is enormous but political limits are real? The air war was another preview of the future. Over northwestern Korea, American pilots encountered the MiG Alley, a swept-wing Soviet-designed jet that changed the skies. The area near the Yalu became known as MiG Alley. There, F-86 Sabres and MiG Alley fought at speeds and altitudes that belonged to a new era. The Korean War was the first major conflict where jet versus jet combat mattered. But even in the air, the war was limited. American pilots often faced restrictions near the Chinese border. Enemy aircraft could use sanctuary across the Yalu. The United States had superior training and tactics in many engagements, but the strategic problem remained: how to fight effectively without crossing lines that could expand the war. Army sources note the first encounters with Soviet-made MiG Alley during the period when Chinese intervention became visible on the battlefield. On the ground, technology and improvisation evolved together. Helicopters, still limited by modern standards, became symbols of medical evacuation and command mobility. Radios, artillery direction, air-ground coordination, winter gear, bridging equipment, and supply networks all shaped the fight. The Korean War rarely receives credit as a technological transition, but it was one. It came after the propeller-driven mass warfare of World War II and before the missile age fully matured. It featured jets, helicopters, radar, naval aviation, amphibious operations, and the shadow of nuclear weapons, all in one brutal theater. It was old war and new war at the same time. The Navy's role was just as essential. Carrier aircraft struck targets. Naval gunfire supported ground forces. Amphibious power made Inchon possible. Sea lift kept the war supplied. Korea's geography made the sea a lifeline. The peninsula could be reinforced because American control of the sea allowed troops, tanks, ammunition, fuel, and food to arrive. At Inchon, logistics were not an afterthought, they were part of the victory. Naval History and Heritage Command material on Inchon logistics notes the tidal challenges, muddy waters, and the need to bring landing craft in at high tide or leave them beached until the tides returned. Logistics may be the least cinematic part of war, but it is often the part that decides whether cinematic moments are possible. Task Force Smith lacked what it needed. Pusan survived because supply poured through the port. Inchon succeeded because ships, landing craft, beachmasters, engineers, and port personnel turned a dangerous harbor into a gateway. Chosin survivors reached evacuation because roads, air support, and sea power were coordinated under pressure. The Korean War was a reminder that patriotism without preparation is not enough. Courage needs ammunition, sacrifice needs planning, strategy needs ports. Then came the long middle of the war, the part memory often skips. From July 1951 to July 1953, negotiations and fighting existed side by side. The front hardened. The war became a contest of pressure. Hills gained names like Heartbreak Ridge, Bloody Ridge, Old Baldy, Pork Chop Hill. These were not empty symbols. They were high ground, observation points, bargaining chips, and killing zones. Men fought for ridge lines that seemed small on a map but controlled movement, visibility, and negotiating leverage. Army historical material identifies this final period as the years of stalemate, when battle lines changed less dramatically but combat remained violent. For the soldier, stalemate did not mean stillness. It meant patrols in darkness, artillery at random hours, bunkers carved into frozen earth, monsoon mud, mines, raids, and the knowledge that peace talks might fail at any moment. It meant being told the war might end while still being ordered to attack a hill the enemy would shell by morning. It meant a strange psychological burden, fighting not for a sweeping advance, but to improve a line, strengthen a bargaining position, or prevent the enemy from doing the same. That kind of war can feel endless because the soldier cannot measure progress in liberated cities. He measures it in whether his squad survives the night. The prisoner of war issue became one of the hardest obstacles to peace. Many communist prisoners did not want forced repatriation. The United States and its allies resisted returning prisoners against their will. The communist side demanded repatriation. Negotiations dragged while the war continued. Camps became tense and sometimes violent. The Armistice talks were not a simple pause between battles. They were another battlefield, where ideology, propaganda, law, and human fear collided. The National Archives notes that surviving prisoners of war were exchanged in operations known as Little Switch and Big Switch toward the end of the war. Meanwhile, politics shifted in America. Truman chose not to run again. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who had led Allied forces in Europe during World War II, became president in January 1953. The war had worn down public patience. It had cost lives without producing the kind of victory Americans had been conditioned to expect. Yet the line had held. South Korea still existed. The communist invasion had not succeeded. The United Nations coalition had not been driven into the sea. The conflict had been contained at terrible cost. On the 27th of July, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed. It stopped the fighting, established mechanisms around the ceasefire line, and left Korea divided. It was not a peace treaty. The Republic of Korea was not a signatory, as President Syngman Rhee opposed the arrangement. North and South Korea remained separate, occupying almost the same territory they had when the war began. That is why the ending feels unresolved. In World War II, surrender documents produced final images. In Korea, the final image was a ceasefire table, a line, and a silence that was never the same thing as peace. The guns stopped, but the war's consequences remained alive. The demilitarized zone became one of the most fortified borders on Earth. American troops stayed in South Korea. The United States built long-term alliances in Asia. South Korea, devastated by war, would eventually become an economic and technological powerhouse. North Korea would become one of the most militarized and isolated states in the world. The Korean War did not end history. It locked history into place. For American veterans, the cost was personal and permanent. Official U.S. defense casualty records list 33,739 hostile deaths in the Korean War, with thousands more dying from non-hostile causes, and the Department of Defense notes that about 789,000 U.S. military personnel served in the Korean War theater. More than 33,000 were killed in battle, and about 7,600 Americans remain unaccounted for. These numbers matter, but numbers can flatten sacrifice. Behind each figure was a family that received a telegram, a mother who kept a photograph, a wife who waited, a child who grew up with a story instead of a father, a veteran who returned with frostbite, nightmares, silence, or pride too heavy to explain. Korea became forgotten not because the men who served forgot it, but because the nation placed it between two louder memories. World War II, the good war with a clear ending, and Vietnam, the divisive war that transformed American politics. Korea did not fit either template. It was necessary but unsatisfying, brave but limited, successful in preventing conquest but unable to deliver peace, and that may be exactly why it matters. The war also shows the strength of South Korea's survival. In 1950, the Republic of Korea nearly disappeared. Its capital fell, its army was battered. Its people suffered invasion, occupation, displacement, and destruction. Yet the state endured. That endurance was not automatic. It was bought by Korean soldiers, American troops, United Nations forces, and civilians who lived through a catastrophe they did not choose. The modern map of East Asia was shaped by their endurance. There is a temptation to call Korea a draw because the border ended near where it began, but that misses the strategic reality. North Korea invaded to unify the peninsula by force. That objective failed. South Korea survived. The United Nations' first major collective security action did not collapse. The United States proved it would defend an ally even in a harsh, distant, politically difficult war. At the same time, America learned that military power had limits when escalation could invite nuclear catastrophe. The Korean War was not a clean victory. It was a costly prevention of defeat, and in the Cold War, preventing defeat could be the difference between containment and collapse. The men who fought it did not have the luxury of historical interpretation. They had orders, weather, fear, weapons, and the man beside them. On the Pusan Perimeter, they bought time. At Inchon, they turned the war. In the mountains near the Yalu, they discovered the danger of outrunning intelligence. At Chosin, they fought through encirclement and cold. Along the Stalemate line, they endured a war that diplomacy had not yet stopped. In the air, pilots entered the jet age. At sea, sailors kept the lifeline open. In hospitals, aid stations, and evacuation routes, medics and support troops fought their own battle against time. The Korean War was a warning written in snow, mud, and steel. It warned that wars can begin faster than governments believe. It warned that underprepared forces pay first. It warned that tactical brilliance can become strategic danger when victory creates overconfidence. It warned that enemies dismissed as unlikely to intervene may already be moving. It warned that limited war is not limited for the men inside it. And it warned that a war can shape the world even when the world tries to forget it. So when we look at Korea today, at the DMZ, at the divided peninsula, at American troops still stationed in South Korea, at the nuclear crisis that continues to haunt Northeast Asia, we are not looking at a frozen relic. We are looking at the unfinished consequences of 1950. The Korean War did not vanish. It became infrastructure. It became alliances. It became deterrence. It became memories carried by aging veterans. It became the line that still cuts across a nation. And maybe that is the final truth. Some wars are remembered because they ended dramatically. Korea must be remembered because it did not. It is the war that proved America would fight for a line, but also that the line between courage and catastrophe could be terrifyingly thin. It is the war where American soldiers held when holding was all that remained, advanced when victory seemed possible, survived when the enemy struck from the mountains, and endured when the world stopped paying attention. If this story helped you see the war from a different angle, leave a like, subscribe to Declassified War Stories, and turn on notifications, because some of the most important battles were never told on the front page.